In this video, we're going to build this cool pricing section UI with Tailwind CSS. We're going to build this pricing card from scratch, so let's get right into it. Here's the Figma design that we're going to use as a reference. We'll be starting off from here with already a heading and intro paragraph. And here's the code for this starting point. We're using Next.js here, and we'll be working in a different component file, this pricing plans component. And here's the component file with our placeholder to do. You can see that at the top, I'm importing some pricing plans data. Here's what this data looks like. So it's an array of 3 pricing plans, and we'll be using this content to populate our pricing cards. Each pricing plan has a title, a price, currency, etc., and also a list of features. So let's get rid of our placeholder markup here and start from scratch. I'll have a div that I'll use for styling in a second. And to get started, I'll iterate over our pricing plans and maybe display the title for now. We'll return a div, and it needs a key for which we can use plan.title, and we'll also output the plan.title. And here they are. It's not looking that great just yet, but we're going to work on that starting now. We want the pricing plans to display in 3 columns like this, so let's define the wrapping div as a grid container. And since I want 3 columns, I'm going to go with grid calls 3. Alright, that's a start. And so we understand a little bit better what space each of these columns is using. I'm going to add a border around each. So on this plan card div here, I'll add a border. And the color we want here is border slate 200. That might be a little hard to see on a video, so I may as well add the card's drop shadow right away. And for that, I'll use shadow and select the large one. Okay, next I'll add some internal padding inside the card with P-8. Okay, it's starting to take shape. One thing that bothers me is these cards are touching each other here. You can see that we don't have any space, any gap between each of the cards. So let's add that on our grid container element with the gap utility, and I'll go with the gap of 8. Yeah, nice. Next, we obviously don't want our pricing cards to be that close to the paragraph tag here, and we also don't want them to span across the whole width of the viewport all the way to the edges. So let's start by adding some vertical padding. I'll go with PY24 to give us plenty of breathing room. Next, we want to align our grid to this heading section here. So we want the grid to be contained in this sort of max width centered container. If we look at the markup for that section, you can see it's using a centered max width 7XL container, and it's also applying some horizontal padding. So we'll do the same here, max width 7XL. And now we will center this container with MX Auto. Yep, that's good. And we still need to add some horizontal padding to make sure the alignment is perfect. I will use PX4 on small screens. And then at the small breakpoint, I'll use PX6. And at the large breakpoint, PX8. All right, before we start adding some content to our cards, there's still 2 things missing from our card container. We want these rounded corners here, and we also want to set the background of the card to white, because as you can see here, the background color changes, and we want the card to remain white on top of it. So in my card wrapper, I will add BG white, and for the rounded corners, I will use rounded 2XL. Okay, I'm happy with that. Let's now go and progressively add some content to the cards. First thing I'll do is wrap the plan title in an H3 tag, and under that I'll have a paragraph to display the plan.description. Here we go. And before we add more content, let's style these 2 elements. Here's what we want it to look like, and I'll start with the H3. Here we'll increase the font size with text LG. The font weight will be font semi-bold. And I'll make the line height slightly smaller than the text LG default with leading 5. Okay, good. Let's now style the description. I'll start by adding some margin top with MT-4. The text color here will be text slate 700. I'll make the text a little bit smaller with text small. And finally, increase the line height a little bit with leading 6. And I think it's looking really good. And if I switch back and forth with the Figma document, you can see that we're doing fairly well. The next thing I want to build is this most popular badge here. In our data, each pricing plan has a most popular property set to true or false, and we're going to use this to conditionally display the most popular badge. In the structure of our markup, I think it should come between the title and description. So here I'll do a conditional check, plan.mostpopular, and only if that's the case, I will output a paragraph tag that says most popular. And yep, as expected, it's only showing on the middle pricing card. But now we don't want it to sit here below the title. We want it to be floating on top of the card here. And for that, we're going to use absolute positioning. So I'll add a class name to the paragraph tag and give it a class of absolute. And we want to place it at the top of our card. So I will go top 0. And where did it go? Aha, oops, look, it's right up there at the top of our viewport. Since we want this badge to sit at the top of this card, let's set this card container element to have a position of relative. This is the card container in question. So here, let's add relative. And now our badge is sitting under the top edge of the pricing card, which is what we want. It's not perfectly positioned just yet, but we'll work on that. Let's first apply a few styles to make it look like a badge, and then we'll fine-tune the positioning. The background color will be BG Cyan 500. And we'll change the text color to text white. Nice. Next, let's add some padding around the text. I'll go with px3 horizontally and py 0.5. Okay, let's make the text a bit smaller and bolder with text SM and font semi-bold. I'll also slightly increase the letter spacing with the class of tracking wide. 2 more things to do. I'll add these spill shape rounded corners and a subtle drop shadow. So rounded dash, and here we want to go with full. And for the shadow, I'll use shadow MD. All right, so now let's work on the positioning. Instead of sitting under the edge of the card, we want it to be exactly vertically aligned on top of that edge. So it currently has a position of top 0, and you might be tempted to try something like minus top 4, and that's a little bit too much, so maybe minus top 3. And now it's just a little too low. So that's not very precise, but more importantly, this feels like a magic value to me. We're trying to guess the correct amount of offsets to apply, and this will easily break. When you find yourself doing something like this, it's usually a good idea to try to find a more robust and correct approach. Here, we'll set it back to top 0, and instead we'll use a transform property. I'm going to use translate Y to translate the badge vertically, and since we're going up, we want it to be a negative translate. And for the value of this translate, which is the key part, well, we want our badge to be halfway up across the edge. So we want to translate by 50% or 1/2. And now it's always going to sit exactly across the edge of the card. The cool thing with that approach is if the font size of the badge changes, or if anything that affects the height of the badge changes, well, the badge is always going to translate up by half of its own height, which means it's always going to be perfectly positioned halfway across the edge of the pricing card. All right, let's tackle the next section of our pricing card, which is the price itself. I'll first write the markup for it, and then we'll apply some styles. So below our plan description, let's have a div. And I'll have a paragraph tag here with 3 different span elements. The first one will display the plan.currency. The second will be the price itself. And the third one will be the frequency of payments. And I'll just add a $sign before the price, since the price property is just a number. All right, and now let's style this. The div element I've just created will be used to style this background. So there is a background color, rounded corners, and some internal padding, as well as margin top. Let's start with the margin top of 4. We'll have a background color of BG Slate 50. And this might be very subtle on video, so while I work on it, let me change this to Cyan 200. All right, let's add some padding with P-6. And for the rounded corners, I'll use rounded LG. Now, let's take a look at the Figma design. If I highlight one of these prices, you can see that this element comes much closer to the left and right edges of the card compared to the rest of the elements. All the other elements, like the badge, the title, or the description, are all positioned 32 pixels from the edge of the card. And matter of fact, the price text itself is also 32 pixels from the edge. But as you can see, we have this background here that somewhat bleeds out of the internal padding of the rest of the card. Everything else inside the card has the same internal padding of 32 pixels, which is why we've applied internal padding directly on the card container. The problem we have now is our price wrapper is also receiving this padding. One solution would be to remove the internal padding on the card element itself and then apply individually P-8 horizontally to each individual element. So that also means on the features and then on the button. But that's pretty painful, and we can actually use a much better trick here and use negative margins horizontally on our card to force this element to sneak out of the internal padding of the card. There's our internal padding level 6 on that price wrapper, and I will go negative MX for margin left and right, level 6. And that's exactly what we wanted. And our price text inside that wrapper is perfectly aligned with the other elements. Okay, let me quickly change that background color back to slate 50. And we can now apply some styles to the text itself. Both the frequency and the currency will have the same styles, so I'll apply this on this wrapping paragraph tag. We'll have small text with text SM. We'll make the font semi-bold and the color text slate 500. So that's inherited by the 3 spans, and now we're going to apply different styles for the price itself. Here, the text is going to be much bigger with text 4XL. And let's have a darker color with text slate 900. Nice. Next, I want to apply some separation from the left, so I'll have a margin left of level 3. And while I'm doing this, on the next element, I will also have a margin left, and here we'll go with 1.5. All right, starting to look good. The main difference with the design for now is we baseline align here, whereas in the design, everything is center aligned. And there's different ways to achieve this, but I personally like to use flexbox for this. So on the parent element here, I will set the display to flex. This is going to align everything to the top because the default value of align items is flex start, but I'll change this to center with items center. And now our pricing elements are perfectly centered aligned vertically. Okay, let's move to the next section, the features. As always, let's start with the markup. I'll just put a little comment here and scroll down a little bit. So here we'll have an unordered list. And then for each feature in plan.features, we'll have a list item. Let's give it a key of feature, which is just a text string. And let's also for now just display that feature. All right, this is what we want. Let's apply some spacing on the UL element. Here I'll use empty-6. And we also want some spacing between each LI item. And we can also do that on the UL element with the space between utility. And we'll use 4 here. Yep, that's great. Let's change the text size and color for these list items. Text SM. The color will be text slate 700. And I'll increase the line height a little bit with leading 6. All right, this is looking good. But if we look at the design, you can see that next to each list item, we have this checkmark icon here. I'll quickly grab this as an SVG, copy as SVG. Let me just wrap the feature text in a span. And above that, I'll paste the SVG code. I'll change a few things here. I'll remove the width and height attributes, since we're going to control that with utility classes. And also here on the fill color, even if it's the right color, I want to use utilities for that. So I'll set that to current color. Okay, our SVG is definitely working, but it's way too big right now. So let's add a class name attribute to our SVG, and let's reduce the height and width with H5 and W5. Nice, and we'll change the color to text cyan 500. All right, much better, but we obviously want the checkmark and the text side by side instead of on top of each other. So let's see what happens if I tell the SVG element to float to the left. And maybe on the feature span here, I add a margin left of 3. Well, that looks pretty good, except when the text is longer than one line like here. And you can see the text wraps under the check mark here, which looks a little bit odd. And in the Figma design, multi-line text clearly behaves differently. The second line of text doesn't slide under the check mark icon. We basically have 2 columns, one for the check mark and then one for the text. To do that, instead of using floats here, we'll use once again our good friend flexbox. So in my SVG, I will delete this float left class. And instead on the LI item, which is the parent of the SVG and the text, I will set the display to flex. And just like that, boom, our alignment is exactly like we want. However, there's a sneaky little side effect of using flexbox here. You can see that this checkmark is smaller than the other one. It'll become even more pronounced if I resize the width of the screen. And right now, everything looks out of alignment here. So what happens is in the places where there's more text, like these two, the checkmark shrinks to try to allow more space available for the text. In our case, we want the little checkmarks to stick up for themselves and refuse to shrink. So back in the SVG class name attribute, I will add a class of shrink 0, which will essentially tell that this element is not allowed to shrink. And now the alignment is perfect no matter how much text there is on a given list item. Our checkmark is standing its ground and refusing to let the text push it over. All right, this is our features section done. We can now move to the last element in our card, the call to action button. After the unordered list, we will have our call to action. This will be a simple anchor tag. We won't worry about the href attribute, and the text will be our plan.cta for call to action. So here it is, and let's start styling it. To make it look like a button, let's start with the background and text color. The text will be white, and the background will be cyan 500 by default, and on hover, cyan 600. Okay, that's a start. Let's add some margin top. Here I want a decent amount of it, so empty-8. And it's not doing anything. And the reason is our anchor tag is an inline element, and for it to respect the vertical spacing, I'm going to change it to display block. So I'll add the block class. And now the margin top is respected, and our element is also taking the whole block level width. The next obvious pain point is the padding. Let's go with px6 and py4. Nice. For the text styles, I'll go with text small, font semi-bold, and leading 4. Okay, let's also make it centered, text center. Next, we'll add rounded corners with rounded LG. And finally, we can add a drop shadow with shadow MD. Okay, this looks great, but the 3 buttons look identical. In the design, it's only the most popular plans button that looks like this. The other 2 plans have a different color scheme. So let's fix that. We're going to use the most popular property to conditionally style the buttons, just like we've conditionally displayed this most popular badge. We need to bring some JavaScript logic in our class name attribute. So let's update it to use template tags. And I'll give myself some space here. And we're going to interpolate some JavaScript here. And I will ask if this plan is the most popular plan, ? If the answer is yes, we're going to have a set of classes. And if the answer is no, we're going to have another set of classes. So if the plan is the most popular, I'm going to move some of the classes from up here, like text white, background cyan 500, the hover background color as well, and finally the shadow. So now these classes will only be applied to the element if the plan is the most popular. And if it's not, instead we're going to have text cyan 700 for the text color, and the background will be BG cyan 50 by default, and on hover BG cyan 100. And just like we were hoping for, our button styles are now different if the plan is most popular or not. This is great, but we have one more problem with our buttons, and this is the fact that the buttons are not sitting at the bottom of the card like it's the case in the Figma design. We're going to set the entire card as a flex container, and then we'll tell one of these elements, for example this unordered list, to use all the available space possible except the space for the button. On our card wrapper element here, I will add a class of flex. And this by itself is going to completely explode the design. Yep, since the default direction for flex is flex row, so every element is side by side. But if I also add flex col, everything is back in place now. But the great thing is I can tell any of the flex children elements to grow and use as much space as it can, which in turn will make our button go to the bottom. I will scroll down to the unordered list, and here I'll give a class of flex1. And ta-da! Our pricing cards now look exactly like we want. Alright, this is looking super nice. Before we wrap up, let's do a couple more things to really bring this project home. The first thing I want to do is make this grid responsive, because right now, if I reduce the screen width, everything gets squished, and that's not great. Let's just drastically improve the situation by stacking the pricing cards on top of each other, and then maybe from the large breakpoint, display them in 3 columns. So in our grid container, where we're setting grid cols 3, let's make that happen only from the large breakpoint. Which means that before that, the grid will have only 1 column, and so the cards will stack on top of each other. Let's try that out and make the screen smaller until it goes below the large breakpoint, like here. And now our cards are stacked on top of each other. I think because we have this badge here, we should increase the gap a little bit. So where we have gap 8 here, let's also apply this at the large breakpoint. And before, by default, let's increase the gap to 12. Let's have a look. And yeah, I think that looks really nice like this. All right, our pricing cards are technically completely done now, but let's implement one more thing, the background color split behind the cards. Behind our cards, we have this split background color action going. We have the bottom half of our cards, which has a light gray background color, where the top half is white. And you can see the split happens right at the middle of our cards vertically. We want to split the background color for this div in half white at the top and half slate 50 at the bottom. And what we're going to use to achieve this, you might have guessed it, flexbox once again. This is the element that contains the height that we want to split in half with the background color. So here's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to wrap this in another div, and let's bring the closing tag right at the bottom. And this div here will have a class of relative. Then, and I'll have a little comment here saying background decoration, I will have another div with a position of absolute. And I want this div to cover the entire space that is covered by this element. So I will also add a class of inset0. So it fills up the entire available space. If I were to give a background color of BG cyan 200 to this element, we can verify that it's filling the entire space of the grid container. It's not the whole page, but only really the grid section. So how do we split that section in two? We're going to have two elements inside of that div. Let's create one with the background of indigo 200, and the second one will actually be our cyan 200, and I'll delete the background color class from the parent here so we can see what we're doing. So we're trying to see half the background indigo 200 and then half the background cyan 200. Right now we don't see anything, but that's where flexbox comes handy. The parent will be display flex. We'll give both these divs a class of flex1 to make it use as much space as is available, and since both of them are trying to do this, they should each take half the available space. Alright, and while this looks really cool, the split is happening vertically and we want ours horizontally. That's a very, very easy fix. All I have to do is change the flex direction from flex row to flex col. And just like that, we have a perfectly centered split in the middle of our card section. And the cool thing with that approach is if I start removing elements, you can see the split always stays right in the middle since the top and bottom half are each taking 50% of the available space. This is awesome. So while I personally do love these colors like this, let's make it match the design so we have white on top and slate 50 on the bottom. To have this first section white, I can just remove the background color since the background behind it is white. There you go. And we'll change this to background slate 50. And with that, we've got our pricing section completed. Here's what our build looks like. And here's what the Figma design looks like. I'd say we've done a pretty good job here. And that's about it, friends. I hope you enjoyed this video and found a few interesting learning nuggets along the way. As always, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you again very soon. Have a good one.